Episode 3 Marsha Blackburn, Bigot Tactics, and the Push for Illegal Anti-Doxing Laws. You already know. Open hearts, open minds, and your eyes are focused on ice. Welcome back to another episode of Eyes on Ice. Knowledge is power, and knowing our rights is how we stand together against the manufactured silence. Today, we're exposing Marsha Blackburn's blatant bigotry as she pushes so-called anti-doxing laws, thinly veiled attempts to shield the powerful while criminalizing public accountability. These laws aren't just legally dubious. They're designed to discourage scrutiny. They're designed to suppress rightful resistance against systemic cruelty and further entrench the powerful count on fatigue. Burning at both ends looking to uncover these tactics. But we know staying vigilant is how the lies unravel, how injustices are exposed by a government and how change bury the truth. If you believe in keeping this fight alive, you can help sustain the movement at Ko-fi. Let's keep watch. Together. That's K-O-F-I.com. Eyes on Ice continues because of those who refuse to look away. Support Eyes on Ice at kofi.com/eyesonice. kofi.com/EYESONICE. Solidarity makes the difference. Let's get into it. Every action sharpens the focus. Every voice brings clarity.
Okay, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to take a deep dive into a stack of source material focusing on a prominent political figure, Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee.
That's right. We've been given several documents here, primarily an in-depth analysis and, well, a more pointed critique that examine her public record and policy proposals.
Yeah, and our task is really to unpack what these specific sources highlight.
Yeah.
What their analysis reveals.
Exactly. And specifically, this deep dive is going to focus on the criticisms and allegations presented within these sources. We're talking about Senator Blackburn's ethical conduct, her legislative efforts, and her views on some pretty contentious issues.
Contentious is putting it mildly, like race, migration, and what's often broadly referred to as wokeness.
Right. So think of this as us sifting through the information these particular documents provide. We're here to understand the key points and critiques they raise about the senator's record, particularly as they frame questions of accountability, civil liberties, and, well, the concerns these sources highlight regarding her rhetoric on race and identity.
Exactly. We're your guides through this material. We're going to unpack what the sources present, see what stands out, what connections they draw.
And what their analysis is really trying to convey about Senator Blackburn's record and impact, specifically, through the critical lens provided by these documents.
Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this material. So the sources we have, they start by giving us a profile of Senator Blackburn, looking at her public record. But the analysis pretty quickly zeroes in on allegations related to ethical conduct.
Okay.
And how her moral and social positions, along with her views on race and migration, are perceived and, well, critiqued by these authors.
Right. This initial segment from the sources really sets the tone, doesn't it?
Right.
By presenting specific incidents and long-held stances that the authors then use to build their broader analysis and critique.
It does. And a notable incident highlighted early on concerns an allegation of an ethical lapse. It involves a traffic stop.
A traffic stop.
Okay. This event is detailed as occurring on April 9th, 2021.
Tell us what happened according to the sources.
Well, the sources highlight that a watchdog group, the Campaign for Accountability, or CFA, they filed a formal complaint about this incident, filed it with the Senate Select Committee on Ethics.
A formal ethics complaint. And what was the substance of it? What was CFA's complaint about?
The allegation basically was that Senator Blackburn may have violated Senate ethics rules by improperly using her position to influence a Capitol police officer.
Influence them how?
This happened while she was a passenger in a vehicle that was pulled over for a traffic violation.
So, wait, she wasn't even driving, but allegedly intervened. How did she supposedly do that?
According to a CNN report, which is cited within the CFA complaint, and the sources note this was purportedly corroborated by a text message from one of the senator's aides.
Okay.
The description of the event is that she hopped out, flashed her PIN, hopped back in the car, and said, "Drive."
Flashed her PIN, meaning her senatorial PIN, to identify herself as a senator.
That's the interpretation drawn by the CNN report cited by CFA, and it's echoed in our sources here. Now, her office did confirm that a traffic stop occurred, but their account differed quite a bit.
How so?
They claimed the officer actually requested her identification, which, as the sources point out via the CFA complaint, is pretty unusual, right? Given she wasn't the driver.
Yeah, that seems odd. Why would a police officer ask a passenger for ID unless they were maybe planning to cite the passenger for something or were perhaps influenced by who they were.
Exactly. And that's precisely where CFA's argument, as presented in the sources, is focused. They stated that this conduct, if it was accurately reported, represents a, quote, cut and dried example of an elected official abusing her position to avoid consequences other citizens face.
Wow. Cut and dried. That's strong language. And they explicitly connect this to Senate ethics rules.
They do. The CFA complaint referenced Senate rules of conduct that specifically state senators should not use their official position or status to obtain special or favorable treatment.
Makes sense.
And the sources note that CFA also drew parallels to past ethics cases, and, to underscore the severity of alleged abuse of status, even in seemingly minor situations.
What historical examples did they cite? Any names?
Yeah, they mentioned Senator Larry Craig. He received an admonishment from the Ethics Committee back in 2007 for showing a business card during an arrest and asking, "What do you think about that?"
Okay, I remember that.
And Representative Barney Frank, who was reprimanded in 1990 for intervening to fix parking tickets accumulated by his aide.
Ah, okay. So the sources point out that even seemingly minor incidents, if they're perceived as leveraging official status for personal benefit, have historically led to ethics consequences.
Yes, that historical context is provided in the sources to highlight the standard against which the CFA is measuring this incident. The sources then draw implications from the specific event if the CFA's account holds true.
Right.
They identify what the sources describe as a dissonance with Senator Blackburn's public image.
A dissonance. How does this incident create a dissonance? What's the clash?
Well, the sources note that Senator Blackburn consistently presents herself as a strong proponent of strict law enforcement and personal accountability. She frequently champions rigorous adherence to laws, particularly concerning immigration and crime, advocating for significant penalties for violations.
Right. Tough on crime, tough on borders.
Exactly. Yet the allegation suggests a private action where her senatorial status was potentially used to bypass a routine legal consequence, a traffic ticket.
Ah, I see. So her public stance demanding strict legal adherence for others seems to be in tension with an alleged private action seeking personal exemption from a minor infraction.
That's the potential dissonance the sources emphasize. They suggest that such a contradiction, if perceived as true, could be interpreted by critics as a form of hypocrisy.
Which could potentially erode public trust, right?
That's what they argue. The sources explicitly state that even seemingly small incidents of this nature can contribute to the erosion of public trust if they are viewed as an abuse of privilege, especially when the official champions policies imposing significant penalties on others.
That's a powerful insight drawn by the sources, how a seemingly minor alleged ethical lapse can undermine the credibility of someone who takes very firm public stances on law and order.
It really highlights the sources' focus on examining the potential gap between stated principles and observed actions. That's a theme that kind of recurs in their analysis.
Okay.
Now, importantly, the sources mention that the final disposition of this specific CFA complaint by the Senate Ethics Committee isn't detailed in the material they provide.
Okay. So we don't know the outcome.
Right. So while the allegation is presented and analyzed for its potential implications, we don't have the outcome of the formal ethics process from these particular documents.
Understood. Okay. Moving beyond that specific incident, the sources also discuss her broader stances on morality and social issues, describing her as a staunchly conservative figure.
Absolutely. The sources position her firmly within the conservative political landscape. They note her close alignment with the Tea Party movement and her consistent support for former President Donald Trump. Her public positions definitely reflect this alignment across a wide range of social issues.
This includes strong opposition to abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and the Affordable Care Act. Right. Those are kind of the big ones.
Yes, those are highlighted. Her stance on abortion in particular is described as particularly prominent in the sources. She has consistently and actively opposed abortion access and worked towards the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
And the sources give examples of her legislative efforts on this, specific actions.
They do. Back in 2013, while she was serving in the House of Representatives, she was actually selected to manage the floor debate for a bill. This bill aimed to ban abortions after 22 weeks of gestation, allowing only very limited exceptions.
Okay.
Later, in 2015, she chaired a select investigative panel.
And that panel focused on Planned Parenthood. I think I remember this.
Yes, it looked into allegations regarding Planned Parenthood, specifically focusing on claims of illicit fetal tissue sales.
Right. And what did subsequent investigations reveal about those allegations? Did they find anything?
Well, the sources point out that subsequent investigations, the ones following her panel's work, actually found no evidence of such sales or other wrongdoing by Planned Parenthood.
Despite those findings, the sources note a controversial ad she used later.
They do. They highlight a 2017 ad from her Senate campaign where she claims she fought Planned Parenthood and we stopped the sale of baby body parts. The sources present this as an example of her readiness to use strong, emotionally charged language, even when fact-checked information contradicts the claims.
And was that specific claim about stopping the sale of baby body parts the only one fact-checked? Or were there others?
The sources also cite that in 2015, she made a claim that 94% of Planned Parenthood services were abortion-related. Factcheck.org, as noted in the sources, determined this claim was wrong.
94%, yeah, that sounds high.
Yeah, FactCheck said it was impossible to accurately determine that percentage, but the figure she presented was incorrect.
So the sources explicitly point to instances where her public statements, particularly regarding Planned Parenthood, have been fact-checked as misleading, and they contrast them with the findings of investigations.
That's a key point in the analysis presented by the sources. They suggest that this readiness to use strong language sometimes contradicted by factual findings or fact-checking, could be indicative of her methodology in addressing other policy issues. This is framed by the sources as relevant to their broader interest in examining political rhetoric and potentially exposing lies, as was mentioned in the prompt material we received.
Okay. Beyond the specific Planned Parenthood claims, how do the sources characterize her overall political style? Is it just about language?
Well, the sources describe her approach as characterized by a notable unwillingness to compromise. They actually cite her public statement, "No compromise, no apologies," as indicative of this style.
No compromise, no apologies.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah, suggesting it dismisses the value of, bipartisan negotiation or finding middle ground.
And the sources connect this no compromise stance to her use of factually contested claims. Is there a link there?
They draw that connection. The sources suggest that combining a no compromise, no apologies posture with using claims that have been fact-checked as misleading points to a political strategy.
A strategy
That may prioritize ideological consistency and impactful messaging over nuanced, fact-based debate or engagement with contrary evidence. This, the sources imply, is a characteristic style of political discourse that shapes her approach to policy issues.
And this style, according to the sources, might influence how her legislative efforts, like the Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act, are framed.
Precisely. The sources suggest this pattern raises questions about whether the justifications she provides for such legislation are built upon widespread, verifiable evidence, or if they are primarily driven by that same uncompromising stance and strong messaging.
Potentially overlooking or downplaying other concerns.
Exactly. Potentially overlooking or downplaying countervailing rights and concerns, such as those related to the First Amendment.
Which serves as a perfect bridge to our next segment, actually, where the sources delve deeply into her views on race, migration, and wokeness. And they present what they view as grounds for significant critique, including allegations of bigotry.
Yeah, this segment is a central focus in the critique document within our sources. It directly addresses Senator Blackburn's strong public stances on these issues, and the sources explicitly present these views as forming the basis for critiques, including allegations of racism and xenophobia from various critics cited.
Okay, let's start with her well-known opposition to critical race theory, or CRT, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives. How do the sources describe her position on those?
She is presented as a very vocal and adamant opponent of both. The sources quote her defining CRT as a radical school of thought used by the political left to assign racial significance to objectively neutral concepts like history and mathematics.
Assigning racial significance to math. Okay. And what's her view on what CRT teaches about America itself?
According to the sources, she asserts that CRT insists that America is a racist country and teaches that all individuals are either oppressors or victims. She believes this creates, quote, a false narrative of division that pits Americans against each other.
And she's also taken legislative steps based on this opposition, hasn't she?
Yes. The sources note that in June 2021, she co-sponsored a resolution specifically condemning the use of CRT in K-12 schools and teacher training programs.
How does she describe the impact of CRT on children specifically?
The sources quote her stating that CRT teaches children to judge and self-segregate based solely on skin color. She also claimed it tells children they're an oppressor because of the color of their skin.
And she frames her opposition to CRT as anti-racist, is that right?
The sources state she asserts that while CRT is disguised as anti-racist, in reality they sow racial division. So yeah, this framing positions her opposition as a defense against what she sees as divisive ideologies.
Interesting. Her opposition extends beyond CRT to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as well, you said.
It does. The sources note she claims that DEI initiatives have been co-opted by the radical left and contain a hidden agenda to pit Americans of different races, religions, and genders against each other.
A hidden agenda.
Yeah. And in line with this view, she co-led the effort to introduce the Dismantle DEI Act, aiming to eliminate federal funding for such initiatives, and has also sought to make the U.S. military less woke.
And she presents these positions as defending the principle that all Americans must be treated equally. Is that the framing?
That's how her stance is framed in the sources, as a defense against what she characterizes as divisive and discriminatory leftist agendas like CRT and DEI.
Now, the sources we have, they offer a direct critique of this stance, don't they?
They do. Critics, as cited in these documents, argue that her opposition to CRT and DEI effectively rejects legitimate efforts to confront systemic inequality and historical injustices in the U.S.
So they see it differently.
Very differently. Her specific characterization of CRT, according to these critics and sources, is seen as a distortion designed primarily to generate political opposition and stoke division, rather than accurately reflecting the academic discipline itself.
Okay. Turning to immigration now, the sources strongly emphasize her stances on enforcement and border security. That seems like a major focus for her.
Yes, this is presented as a core area of her focus. She consistently advocates for robust border security measures, supporting the construction of border walls and physical barriers like buoys and barbed wire.
Right.
She is staunchly opposed to amnesty for undocumented immigrants and calls for ending sanctuary city policies.
And her legislative proposals reflect these priorities. Any specific bills mentioned?
They are highlighted as doing so. The sources mention bills she has proposed, such as the Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act.
Okay, what would that do?
It would mandate the deportation of undocumented individuals convicted of or even admitting to sex offenses or domestic violence. Another one mentioned is the Container Act, which would explicitly empower border states to place temporary barriers on federal land to deter illegal crossings.
Like shipping containers.
Yeah, that seems to be the idea. A key observation in the sources is her frequent linking of illegal immigration to significant criminal threats.
This is a major point made by the sources when analyzing her rhetoric on immigration, isn't it? The language she uses.
Absolutely. She regularly states that a secure border is essential to block the flow of drugs, human trafficking, terrorists, and other dangerous criminals.
Okay.
The sources also point out that she has cited specific tragic deaths, like those of Laken Riley and Rachel Morin, directly attributing them to violent criminals who were in the country illegally, using these individual tragedies to emphasize the perceived dangers associated with unauthorized immigration.
And she calls for action against local officials regarding immigration enforcement, like mayors.
Yes, the sources mention her public calls for Department of Justice investigations into officials like Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, alleging they are obstructing federal immigration enforcement operations through local policies or transparency initiatives.
Okay. This brings us to specific instances highlighted by the sources as evidence for the critiques of racism or xenophobia. This seems particularly pronounced in the critique document provided.
Yeah, this is where the sources provide specific examples they use to support their strong claims about her rhetoric on race and identity. The first major example they point to is a tweet from December 3, 2020.
Okay, what was the tweet?
Senator Blackburn tweeted, "China has a 5,000-year history of cheating and stealing. Some things will never change."
Wow, cheating and stealing. And how was that tweet received, according to the sources?
Oh, the sources detail immediate and widespread condemnation. Organizations like OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates quickly characterized the tweet as xenophobic and sinophobic, explicitly calling it a racist comment and a direct attack towards Chinese and Chinese Americans.
A direct attack?
Yeah, they argued that it diminishes Chinese culture and heritage and serves to add fuel to the anti-Asian violence prevailing during this pandemic, which was a major concern at the time.
Absolutely. The sources present this tweet and the reaction it garnered as a direct data point for evaluating indications of racist or xenophobic views. That's pretty explicit framing.
They frame it explicitly as such. It's presented as concrete evidence used by the sources to build their case regarding her rhetoric on national origin and race.
Okay. Another significant instance cited is her past involvement with the birther movement.
Yes. The sources note that back in 2009, while she was in the House, she sponsored legislation that would have required presidential candidates to provide proof of their birth certificate.
And the context around that legislation is presented as crucial, right?
Yeah.
Why that specific requirement then?
Absolutely. The sources explicitly state that this bill was introduced as a direct response to the birther conspiracy theories that questioned President Barack Obama's U.S. citizenship and, consequently, his eligibility to be president.
Right, I remember that whole thing.
And these theories were widely understood and viewed, particularly by critics, as racially motivated and aimed at delegitimizing the nation's first African-American president.
Did her office claim she personally believed Obama was not a U.S. citizen at the time?
The sources mention that at the time, a spokesperson for her office stated she did not personally doubt President Obama's citizenship. However, the sources argue that sponsoring such legislation, regardless of personal belief, lent a degree of mainstream political legitimacy to a movement that was widely perceived as racially charged and discriminatory.
Ah, okay. So the act of sponsoring the bill itself, given its context within the birther movement, is presented by the sources as pertinent to any assessment of racially charged political signaling.
That is the precise language used in the sources to frame this action. It's included as relevant evidence in their assessment of her rhetoric and political actions in the context of racial dynamics.
Okay, so based on these specific incidents, the China tweet and the birther bill sponsorship, along with her stated positions on CRT, DEI, and immigration, the sources identify what they describe as a pattern of rhetoric. What's the pattern?
They observe a consistent pattern of what they term us versus them rhetoric. According to the sources, certain groups or ideas, such as advocates of CRT or DEI, undocumented immigrants, or the nation of China, are frequently framed as fundamental threats.
Threats to what?
Threats to American values, national security, or social cohesion.
How do the sources elaborate on how these groups or ideas are framed as threats? Can you give examples?
Yeah, the sources note that CRT is depicted as an ideology that teaches division and presents false narratives, teaching children they are oppressors. Undocumented immigration is consistently linked to a direct flow of serious criminal elements like drugs, human trafficking, terrorists, and other dangerous criminals. The China cheating tweet is highlighted as a sweeping negative generalization about an entire nation and its people. And DEI initiatives are characterized as having a hidden agenda specifically designed to pit Americans against each other.
So this consistent framing creates a clear distinction between an in-group and various out-groups that are portrayed as problematic or dangerous. Is that the analysis?
That's the analysis presented in the sources. They argue that this consistent framing constructs an in-group, those who presumably align with her vision of American values and security, and positions various outgroups as inherently problematic or dangerous.
And what is the critique of this pattern presented in the sources? What's the problem with that?
Well, the sources state that such rhetoric, by consistently framing certain groups as threats, can foster an environment where policies targeting these outgroups, such as stricter immigration enforcement, restrictions on certain educational concepts, or bills restricting certain forms of speech or information related to these groups, are more readily accepted by her supporters. They argue this framing can lead to a minimization of concerns about the rights or fair treatment of these targeted groups. And the critique document specifically calls this identified pattern of discourse a pattern of bigotry, directly connecting the observed rhetoric to that very strong characterization.
A pattern of bigotry. That's a direct quote from the critique document.
Yes, that's the language used in that source. The sources also point out what they see as an apparent inconsistency within her stated positions and actions.
An inconsistency? Like what?
Yes, a notable tension is highlighted when they contrast her assertion that students should not be discriminated against on the basis of race under any circumstances with her past actions.
Specifically
Sponsoring the birther legislation and posting the China cheating tweet.
How do the sources explain this perceived tension? Why is that inconsistent?
They reiterate that the birther movement was widely viewed as a racially tinged attack on President Obama's legitimacy, and sponsoring that bill provided a platform for those views. Similarly, The China tweet was condemned as racist and xenophobic by relevant organizations.
Right.
So the sources argue that these actions appear to be at odds with the very principle of not fostering environments where individuals might be judged, stereotyped, or targeted based on their race or national origin.
So the critique is that there seems to be a contradiction between her stated principles of non-discrimination and actions or rhetoric that have been widely criticized for having discriminatory impacts or signals.
That is precisely the critique presented in the sources. They suggest this apparent inconsistency is highly relevant to the query's interest in exposing lies by highlighting a potential gap between professed ideals and political practice. It's framed as a point of dissonance for you, the listener, to consider when evaluating her public record.
This detailed examination of her views on race and migration, supported by these specific examples and the source's analysis of the resulting pattern of rhetoric, this really seems to be a core component of the critique presented in these documents. It's not just about policy differences, is it? It's about the language and the framing used.
It absolutely is. The sources dedicate significant focus to presenting these specific instances and linking them to a broader pattern of discourse, a pattern that critics, as presented here, identify as problematic, harmful, and in some cases explicitly discriminatory or bigoted.
As highlighted by that OCA condemnation and the critique document's own language.
Exactly. The clear intent here in these sources is to provide the detailed basis for these serious critiques leveled against her.
Okay, let's pivot now to a specific piece of legislation that receives significant attention in the sources. Senator Blackburn's proposed Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act. This segment of the analysis delves into its origins, specific provisions, the constitutional questions it raises, and how its framing is critiqued as potentially misleading.
Right. This bill is analyzed closely by the sources because they seem to use it as a kind of case study. They argue it illustrates how her broader political approach, her focus on specific issues like immigration enforcement, and her concerns about perceived obstruction manifest in concrete policy proposals.
Okay, so what was the specific impetus or genesis of this act, according to the sources? Where did it come from?
The sources explicitly state that the bill, which Senator Blackburn introduced on June 4, 2025, was proposed as a direct response to an action taken by the office of Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell.
Nashville's mayor again. And what action did Mayor O'Connell's office take that prompted this?
Well, as part of a broader transparency initiative within the city government, his office published a spreadsheet. This document detailed communications that had occurred between various city departments and federal immigration agents.
Okay, just tracking communication.
Mostly. But the sources note that in at least one specific instance within that spreadsheet, the names of some federal officials who had initiated these communications were included.
Okay, so the sources framed the bill's origin not as a response to widespread, documented doxing endangering officers across the country, but as a reaction to this specific local incident related to transparency in immigration enforcement.
That is precisely the critique of the bill's genesis presented in the sources. They argue that the bill's origin is not a reaction to a broad, documented crisis of federal officers being systematically endangered by malicious doxing across the nation, but rather a specific countermove in a local political dispute centered on transparency in federal immigration enforcement activities. The sources emphasize that this targeted origin is a key factor in understanding the bill's primary intent and its potential scope, suggesting its purpose is more about this specific political conflict than a nationwide problem.
Interesting. So what are the core provisions of this proposed Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act? What would it actually do?
The central provision highlighted in the sources is that the bill would make it a federal crime to publish the name of a federal law enforcement officer.
Just the name.
With the intent to obstruct a criminal investigation or immigration operation.
With the intent to obstruct.
Okay.
And the penalties if someone is found guilty.
Individuals convicted under this law would face a fine, imprisonment for up to 5 years, or both.
5 years, wow. The sources offer a significant critique regarding how this bill defines doxing, right? Can you break that down? What's the issue there?
Yeah, this is presented as a crucial point of analysis. The sources explain that the common public understanding of doxing usually refers to the act of publicly revealing private, personally identifiable information about someone.
Right.
Things like their home address, private phone number, social security number, or details about their family, typically with a malicious intent to harass, intimidate, or incite harm. That's usually what people mean by doxing.
But Senator Blackburn's bill uses a different broader definition. How does it differ?
Yes, the sources state her bill deviates significantly from this common understanding. Instead of focusing on the release of private information, it criminalizes the publication of an officer's name.
Just their name.
Right. And crucially, it makes this criminal based on whether the publisher has a specific intent to obstruct an investigation or operation.
So it broadens the definition of doxing to potentially include sharing information that is not inherently private, like a public official's name, which might even be in public records already.
That's the analysis. The sources call this distinction paramount, highlighting that it expands the concept of doxing to potentially encompass the sharing of information that is generally not considered private, like the names of public officials acting in their official capacity.
And the intent to obstruct standard. That sounds tricky.
Well, the sources note that proving intent to obstruct is inherently legally challenging and can be highly subjective. They argue this standard raises significant concerns about its potential to chill legitimate speech.
Like criticism.
Yeah, particularly speech that is critical of law enforcement actions or seeks to promote transparency and accountability, even if the primary motive wasn't malicious obstruction. They also highlight the 5-year sentence as a really severe penalty for publishing information, especially information that could potentially be an officer's name derived from official communications or public records.
What justifications did Senator Blackburn provide for introducing this bill? What did she say it was for?
According to the sources, she stated the bill was necessary to hold Blue City mayors accountable for obstructing enforcement of our immigration laws by putting law enforcement officers in harm's way.
Blue City mayors, okay.
She also asserted that publicly releasing officers' names places them at a higher risk of being targeted by criminal gangs, including MS-13 and Tren de Aragua.
MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. Those are notorious gangs. How do the sources critique these justifications? Do they buy that link?
Well, the sources note that this justification frames the issue in a highly politicized terms, right? Focusing on a conflict with Blue City mayors and linking the publication of names to these specific notorious criminal organizations. However, the sources explicitly state that the available information does not detail specific empirical evidence provided by the senator to directly and broadly substantiate the causal link between the type of name publication seen in Nashville as part of a transparency report and subsequent systematic targeting of federal officers by these specific gangs.
So the sources question the factual basis for her claims, linking this specific type of name publication, like in a city report, to widespread targeted gang violence against federal officers.
They do. The sources imply that the justification provided might be driven more by political messaging and the desire to cast opponents as dangerous obstructionists than by widespread documented evidence directly linking this specific action to broad threats from notorious gangs.
Okay, let's summarize the sources' overall critique of the bill's framing then. What's the big picture issue they raise?
The sources argue the bill appears to use a strategic redefinition of doxing. By focusing on the publication of names, information that is often public for officials, tied to an alleged intent to obstruct, rather than the malicious release of genuinely private, personally identifiable information.
It does what?
It significantly expands the range of speech that could be criminalized beyond the common understanding of doxing.
Which means actions intended for transparency or accountability could potentially be targeted under this law.
Exactly. The sources state that actions aimed at public accountability, such as publishing the names of officials involved in controversial incidents or operations, could potentially be swept up under the severe penalties of this law if prosecutors allege an intent to obstruct. The sources suggest the implication is that the bill is crafted to address situations far removed from traditional malicious doxing.
And this leads to the sources' critique of potential misrepresentation. How might it be misleading?
Yes. The sources argue that if the bill is primarily promoted to the public as protecting officers from the dangerous release of private information, which is the common fear associated with doxing, while its legal text and the context of its origin indicate it targets transparency and the sharing of official information based on alleged intent.
And what?
Then the bill's true scope and consequences might be obscured for the public. People might think it's only about stopping dangerous leaks of home addresses when it could actually cover much more.
The sources suggest this can be interpreted as an attempt to rebrand legitimate acts of transparency or accountability journalism as doxing if they're deemed to have an obstructive intent. Is that fair?
That specific language comes directly from the source's analysis. They describe this as a significant and potentially misleading expansion of the term, highlighting how the bill's title and stated purpose might not accurately reflect its actual legal reach and impact, particularly on protected speech.
This extensive analysis of the doxing bill really shows how the sources dissect the stated rationale versus the potential real-world impact, especially on civil liberties, doesn't it?
It really does, and it connects back to the earlier points the sources made about Senator Blackburn's political style and potential prioritization of messaging. The sources are clearly analyzing whether the stated purpose of this bill, particularly regarding officer safety from gangs, holds up under scrutiny when compared to its text and potential effects on transparency and accountability.
Right. Speaking of civil liberties, the bill raises significant constitutional questions, particularly regarding the First Amendment, which the sources delve into quite deeply.
Oh, absolutely. It raises major questions concerning freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The sources highlight a foundational principle in First Amendment law, reinforced by Supreme Court cases like Smith v. Daily Mail.
What's that principle?
It establishes strong protection for publishing truthful information, especially when it's lawfully obtained or pertains to matters of public record.
So if a federal officer's name is considered public information or is lawfully obtained through channels like public records requests, penalizing its publication based on alleged intent could conflict with this principle. That seems like a big hurdle.
According to the sources and the legal framework they discuss, yes. The government faces a very high constitutional bar to justify restricting the publication of truthful, lawfully obtained information, particularly when it involves public officials performing their duties.
What about situations where information might have been obtained unlawfully, maybe leaked, but the publisher received it legally? Does the First Amendment still protect them?
That's a great question, and the sources reference Bartnicki v. Vopper, a 2001 Supreme Court case that addressed that. This decision affirmed the right to publish truthful information on matters of public concern, even if the original source obtained that information unlawfully,
As long as.
provided that the publisher themselves was not involved in the unlawful act of obtaining it.
Okay, so under Bartnicki, a journalist who receives a list of federal agents involved in a controversial raid from a whistleblower might be protected, even if the whistleblower broke a rule.
That's the implication drawn by the sources.
Hmm.
They suggest that while such a journalist would likely be protected under Bartnicki's precedent, publishing that list could potentially be criminalized under this proposed act if authorities decide to allege it was done with an intent to obstruct an operation. It creates a potential conflict there.
And perhaps the most significant constitutional challenge discussed relates to New York Times v. Sullivan. That's the big one for public debate, right?
Yes, that landmark 1964 decision is absolutely central to the analysis here. It established the principle that there is a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open.
Uninhibited, robust, and wide open.
And the actions of law enforcement officers, especially in sensitive and politically charged areas like immigration enforcement, are unequivocally matters of significant public concern. They fall squarely under that umbrella.
And being able to identify the officers involved is crucial for that public debate and for accountability, isn't it? You need to know who did what.
Exactly. The sources argue that the ability to identify public officials, including law enforcement officers involved in controversial operations or policies, is fundamental for informed public debate, for ensuring government accountability, and for allowing meaningful public scrutiny.
So the bill could stifle that.
Well, the proposed bill, with its severe penalty of up to 5 years in prison for publishing a name with alleged obstructive intent, could create a profound chilling effect on such debate and criticism. Individuals, journalists, and watchdog organizations might just self-censor out of fear of prosecution, even if they believe they have a right to publish.
That intent to obstruct standard, which we discussed earlier, also poses constitutional problems here, you mentioned.
It does. While it adds an intent element, which sounds specific, the sources describe this standard as being fraught with constitutional peril. Proving subjective intent is legally complex, and the term obstruct itself is susceptible to broad, vague, and potentially arbitrary interpretation by prosecutors.
Could investigative journalism that exposes misconduct and then leads to public outcry or changes in operations, could that be interpreted as demonstrating intent to obstruct?
That's the critical question raised by the sources. They suggest the ambiguity of the intent to obstruct standard, particularly when tied to obstructing an immigration enforcement operation, a politically contentious domain, raises serious concerns about its potential for selective or viewpoint-based enforcement.
Meaning it could be used against critics.
The fear is it could be used to suppress speech that is critical of specific policies or the actions of certain agents, rather than speech that genuinely poses a threat.
The sources also questioned the fundamental necessity of this bill, right? Pointing to existing laws that already cover threats.
They do. They cite organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, among others, who argue that existing laws already adequately cover unprotected speech, such as true threats, incitement to violence, and criminal harassment.
So if someone actually threatens an officer,
They can already be prosecuted. The sources question that if current statutes are sufficient to prosecute individuals who genuinely threaten officers based on information release, then the specific targeting of publishing names with alleged obstructive intent seems designed for a different purpose, one that extends beyond simple officer safety into the realm of controlling information and suppressing critical speech.
and this leads to concerns that the bill might be unconstitutionally vague or overbroad, that it sweeps up too much protected speech.
The sources conclude that the bill, particularly the clause criminalizing publishing names with intent to obstruct immigration enforcement, faces a substantial risk of being found unconstitutionally vague or overbroad by the courts. It has the potential to criminalize a range of protected activities, including journalism, whistleblowing, and legitimate public criticism.
And the chilling effect this could have on public discourse seemed to be a major concern for the sources running through this whole analysis.
It really is. The sources argue that the pervasive fear of prosecution under such a broad and potentially vague law could lead to widespread self-censorship among journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens. This could effectively create what the sources describe as a speech-free zone around federal law enforcement activities in immigration matters.
Shielding them from scrutiny.
Exactly, shielding these operations from necessary public scrutiny and accountability. This outcome, they argued, directly undermines the First Amendment's vital role in fostering an informed citizenry capable of holding its government accountable.
The sources also directly address the idea raised in our prompt about exposing lies by examining the stated intent of the bill versus its potential impact. How do they approach that?
Well, this analysis ties back to Senator Blackburn's stated rationale: protecting officer safety from gangs like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua, and holding blue city mayors accountable for obstruction. This frames the issue primarily as one of security and partisan conflict.
But critics, as presented in the sources, have a very different perspective on the importance of officer identification, don't they? They see value in it.
Yes. Critics cited in the sources, including civil liberties advocates and organizations like the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, strongly argued that anonymity for law enforcement officers actually hinders oversight and accountability, can foster intimidation, and ultimately erodes public trust.
Here's accountability.
AILA, for instance, it cited warning that masked or unidentified agents create an environment that chills individuals' willingness to assert their rights, including access to legal representation and due process during encounters. People are less likely to speak up if they don't know who they're dealing with.
So there's a fundamental disagreement highlighted by the sources between the state's asserted need for security and anonymity versus the public's fundamental right to transparency and accountability from government officials.
That's the core tension presented in the sources, exactly. The query's invitation to expose lies is interpreted by the sources as prompting an examination of whether the threats cited by Senator Blackburn are truly proportionate to the bill's potentially sweeping impact on protected speech, access to information, and the ability to hold government accountable.
And the nature of the information being restricted, the officer's name, is critical to this analysis, isn't it?
As we noted earlier, the sources point out that the names of public law enforcement officers, particularly when acting in their official capacity, are not typically considered private information in the same way a home address or social security number is. They're often part of the public record.
Right.
Senator Blackburn's bill, however, criminalizes the sharing of this potentially public information based on an alleged and subjective intent to obstruct.
Which brings us back to the critique of misleading framing, that potential lie.
Precisely. The sources reiterate that the bill's title and stated purpose, protecting law enforcement from Doxing Act, might be significantly misleading if the public understands doxing in its common usage, which is the malicious release of private information.
But the bill targets more than that.
Exactly. The bill, however, targets the publication of names, often official, not private information, tied to an alleged intent to obstruct.
And the potential lie as the sources see it, lies in that discrepancy, that disconnect between the common understanding and the bill's actual scope.
The sources suggest the potential misrepresentation is that the bill is presented to the public as protecting officers from the dangerous exposure of private information, leveraging the common fear associated with traditional doxing, while its actual legal text and context show it also targets legitimate acts of transparency and the sharing of official identifying information if those actions are deemed by authorities to have an obstructive intent.
So it obscures the bill's true, broader scope beyond just protecting genuinely private data, like home addresses.
Yes. The sources argue this effectively rebrands acts of transparency, accountability journalism, or public criticism as doxing if they're deemed by authorities to have an obstructive intent. This is presented as a significant and potentially misleading expansion of the term doxing, which is a central part of the critique document's analysis regarding how the bill is framed versus what it actually does.
This detailed analysis of the doxing bill really reveals the source's concern that the stated purpose might not fully align with the bill's potential legal consequences for free speech and transparency. It's quite a critique.
It absolutely connects directly back to the earlier points the sources made about Senator Blackburn's political style and potential willingness to prioritize messaging over a nuanced engagement with potential impacts. The sources are clearly analyzing whether the specific justification for this bill holds up under scrutiny when compared to its actual text and likely effects on civil liberties.
Okay, let's move on to our final substantive segment. This explores the broader dangers associated with law enforcement operating without clear identification. This section in the sources provides crucial context, arguing that anonymity can facilitate criminal impersonation, abuse, including sexual violence, and erode public trust.
With disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations.
Right. And this ties directly into the potential implications of policies, like the one we just discussed, that critics argue could increase anonymity or chill reporting about officers.
Yeah. This segment provides vital background on why transparency and identification are considered important principles in law enforcement, particularly from the perspective of civil liberties and protecting marginalized communities. It draws on documented incidents and research cited within the sources.
The sources discuss the current federal policy landscape regarding agent identification. And it sounds like it's quite ambiguous and inconsistent, not very clear-cut.
That's a key finding presented in the sources. They describe the existing framework as fragmented and containing significant discretionary loopholes. While the public generally has a First Amendment right to record officials in public spaces, a right that implicitly requires the ability to identify those officials for accountability purposes, federal policies on agent identification are, according to the sources, inconsistent.
How so? What are the inconsistencies?
Well, the DHS use of force policy, updated in February 2023, is cited. It states that law enforcement officers must attempt to identify themselves and issue warnings when feasible before using force.
When feasible. That sounds like a big caveat.
It is, because crucially, the determination of feasibility is left to the officer's discretion.
Okay, so that introduces one layer of ambiguity. Identification is required only if an officer deems it feasible. What else?
Right. The sources also reference a letter sent by Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine in May 2025. They contended that existing DHS regulations already mandate proper identification for immigration officers and limit the use of masks.
So they think a rule's already there.
They cited regulations stating that immigration officers must identify themselves and state the reason for an arrest if it is practical and safe to do so. Additionally, post-warrantless arrest reports are supposed to document whether self-identification occurred.
So some policies seem to push for identification, but they come with conditions like practical and safe. More discretion.
Exactly. Those conditions also involve officer discretion, leaving room for interpretation and noncompliance. And then, the sources highlight what they see as a contradictory practice within ICE policies that allow the use of ruses.
Ruses. What does that involve in this context? What kind of deception?
The sources note that ICE policy allows and even encourages agents to use ruses, which means misrepresenting themselves. For example, pretending to be local police officers in order to gain entry to a location without needing a judicial warrant.
Why would they do that?
Well, this tactic is often used because ICE frequently conducts operations without warrants for home entry and relies instead on obtaining voluntary consent. The sources argue that this deliberate deception appears to contradict the spirit, if not always the precise letter, of policies that call for clear and truthful identification.
So policies might say identify when practical, but operational tactics involve deliberate misrepresentation of identity. That does sound contradictory. How can you trust someone who starts by potentially lying about who they are?
That contradiction is explicitly highlighted by the sources as contributing to opacity and undermining trust. The sources also mention Section 1064 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, which reportedly requires federal officers responding to civil disturbances to visibly display individual and agency identification, though they note the applicability of this section to routine ICE enforcement actions is unclear in the sources provided.
So the overall picture painted by the sources seems to be one of fragmented policies and discretionary practices rather than clear, mandatory identification standards. Is that a fair summary?
That's exactly what the sources explicitly conclude. They say the existing framework is fragmented, relies heavily on discretion, when feasible, practical, and safe, and contains loopholes. Combined with practices like using ruses, they argue this consistently obscures agent identity.
And the effect?
They state this lack of consistent, mandatory identification fosters public distrust and fear, particularly among vulnerable populations who might not know their rights or what to expect.
And this lack of clarity seems to fuel both calls for greater transparency and legislative efforts, like Senator Blackburn's bill, which critics argue restricts access to information. It's like a vicious cycle.
The sources describe it as a reactive cycle. Opacity from authorities leads to public concern and demands for transparency. This, in turn, can sometimes lead to legislative efforts like the Doxing Act, which critics argue restrict information or chill reporting instead of leading to the adoption of clear, consistent identification standards across federal law enforcement.
Now, the sources provide documented incidents to show the concrete dangers that can arise from this lack of clear identification, particularly concerning criminal impersonation and abuse. This sounds serious.
This is where the analysis connects the policy ambiguity directly to real-world harm. The sources argue that the lack of clear, consistent identification standards makes it significantly easier for criminals to impersonate law enforcement officers.
And who do they target?
These impersonators then prey on the public, especially migrants unfamiliar with their rights or fearful of authorities, who may be less likely to question someone appearing to be an officer.
Can you give some examples of these impersonation incidents cited in the sources? What actually happened?
Yes, the sources detail several disturbing incidents. On January 29, 2025, in South Carolina, a man named Sean Michael Johnson was charged with kidnapping and impersonating a police officer. He was accused of threatening deportation, mocking, and stealing from Latino men.
Just awful.
On February 1, 2025, in Philadelphia, several individuals, including Temple University students, were charged with impersonating ICE officers. They reportedly wore shirts saying police or ICE and attempted to gain entry to a dorm and a store.
College students doing that. Wow.
On February 2, 2025, in North Carolina, Carl Thomas Bennett was arrested for allegedly impersonating an ICE officer, sexually assaulting a woman, displaying a fake badge card, and threatening her with deportation.
Sexual assault linked to impersonation.
Yes. And the sources also mention an undated case from California where Romanian nationals were charged with robbery and hate crime enhancements. They were accused of posing as ICE officers, specifically targeting Hispanic street vendors in Spanish.
Why target them?
The sources note the criminals targeted these individuals believing they wouldn't contact the police due to their immigration status or fear of authorities, exploiting that vulnerability.
Those examples are incredibly stark and concerning. It really brings the risk home.
They are, and the sources use them to demonstrate the tangible and severe dangers of impersonation facilitated by a lack of clear identification. The North Carolina case directly links impersonation to sexual assault, while the California case links it to hate motivation and targeting based on ethnicity and perceived vulnerability due to immigration status.
And these real-world examples, according to the sources, directly validate the warning from Senators Warner and Kane that we mentioned earlier.
The sources explicitly state that these examples directly validate Warner and Kane's warning that bad actors have and will continue to take advantage of ICE's lack of transparency to perpetrate crimes on the most vulnerable in our society.
So, the sources argue that the ease with which impersonators can operate is directly linked to the public's uncertainty about what legitimate agents look like, how they identify themselves, or what their standard procedures are. Is that the core argument?
That's the connection the sources draw. They argue this uncertainty is significantly exacerbated when actual agents wear masks, use unmarked vehicles, or employ deceptive tactics like ruses. It muddies the waters for everyone.
And the conclusion from this?
The sources conclude from these documented cases that policies allowing obscured identity, even if intended for officer safety, have a demonstrable and serious side effect. They increase the vulnerability of the public, especially marginalized groups, to criminal predation exploiting the guise of authority. This, they argue, directly undermines public safety, particularly for those most vulnerable.
This leads us to the increased risk of sexual violence and assault, especially for migrants, which the sources link as a direct consequence of this anonymity or obscured identity. That's a very heavy charge.
The sources argue forcefully that anonymity, whether of actual officers or those impersonating them, significantly heightens the risk of sexual violence and assault, especially for already vulnerable migrant populations.
Why migrants in particular?
Migrant women are highlighted as particularly susceptible due to factors like lack of established support networks, unfamiliarity with legal and social systems, language barriers, pre-existing distrust of authorities, and crucially, a deep fear of deportation, which abusers can powerfully leverage.
And research is cited to support these points about vulnerability and fear of reporting.
Yes, the sources cite research indicating that immigrant women and girls, particularly those with undocumented or temporary status, are often terrified to report crimes, including sexual assault, due to an overwhelming fear of deportation or retaliation from authorities.
That makes sense.
They also note that LGBTIQ+ migrants face compounded risks, including abduction, torture, and abuse, not only from criminal groups along migration routes, but, as documented by human rights organizations, sometimes by authorities themselves.
By the actual authorities.
Yeah.
Not just impersonators.
Yes, that's what the sources cite from human rights reports. And the sources specifically mention perpetrators who are in positions of power or authority.
Like?
They do. The sources mention reports of supervisors and crew leaders being implicated in workplace sexual violence against migrant farm workers. They also cite allegations from LGBTIQ+ migrants of extortion, collusion with criminal groups for kidnapping and assault, and abuse by Mexican immigration agents, police, and National Guard members.
So the argument is?
The sources argue that if individuals wielding state authority, or simply its appearance, are operating without clear identification or a mask, the pathways to accountability for their abuses are severely constricted, if not entirely closed. How do you report someone you can't identify?
Right. Sexual assault is already widely underreported, and these barriers seem magnified for immigrants. It sounds almost impossible to overcome.
That's a key point. Fear of deportation, negative past experiences with authorities, lack of language access, and sometimes facing dismissive treatment all make reporting incredibly difficult. If a victim cannot identify their assailant, especially if they believe the assailant is or purports to be a law enforcement officer with perceived impunity, the obstacles to reporting and seeking justice become almost insurmountable.
Academic research also seems to connect the dots between impersonation, sexual misconduct, and targeting vulnerable individuals, according to the sources.
The sources cite research indicating that police impersonators have been known to use the guise of authority for extortion and sexual favors. They also reference research suggesting that police sexual misconduct often targets vulnerable individuals in low-visibility situations and is frequently unreported due to victim humiliation or fear of retaliation. Anonymity, the sources argue, logically increases both the opportunity and the likelihood of such abuse occurring and going unreported.
And international examples reinforce this link between impunity, often stemming from anonymity, and severe human rights violations. Are there parallels elsewhere?
Yes. The sources mention that major human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have documented patterns in various countries where impunity, often enabled by anonymity or lack of identification for security or law enforcement personnel, correlates strongly with severe human rights violations.
Like what?
Including widespread sexual violence against vulnerable populations such as detained refugees or migrants in places like Libya, women detainees in Afghanistan, or children in El Salvador by security forces. It's a documented pattern globally.
So the source's conclusion from all this is that unidentified or masked officers, particularly in sensitive contexts like immigration enforcement involving vulnerable people, significantly elevate the risk of sexual assault and abuse. It's a structural risk factor.
That's the strong conclusion they draw. They argue this happens through two main mechanisms. First, it can embolden actual officers who are inclined towards misconduct by reducing their perceived risk of accountability if they cannot be identified.
Less chance of getting caught.
Right. Second, it makes it much easier for criminals to successfully impersonate officers and commit crimes, including sexual assault, while hiding under the cloak of authority.
And the impact on victims.
The sources emphasize that migrant communities, who are often already fearful of authorities, are less likely to question or resist someone appearing to be an officer, and significantly less likely to report abuse if the perpetrator is unidentified or perceived as a state actor with impunity.
So policies that allow or contribute to obscured identity in encounters with vulnerable populations, according to the sources, actively work against efforts to prevent abuse and ensure accountability. They actually make things worse.
That's the powerful argument made by the sources. They state these policies inadvertently create a systemic environment where the risk of such abuse is structurally amplified, making vulnerable individuals even more susceptible to harm from both legitimate authorities who abuse power and criminals who exploit the appearance of authority.
Finally, the sources discuss how this issue of anonymity erodes public trust and broader accountability for law enforcement. It's not just about individual incidents.
Exactly. Walter Olson of the Cato Institute is cited within the sources, arguing that masking by law enforcement is often, perhaps usually, a tactic designed to avoid legal and public accountability.
Avoid accountability. How?
He points to instances like DHS reportedly defying a judge's demand to identify officials responsible for removal decisions in contempt proceedings, presenting this as a direct link between masking non-identification and a deliberate avoidance of established accountability mechanisms.
And the impact on community relations is also a factor. How does anonymity affect day-to-day interactions?
Yes, the sources mention that organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police have warned that face coverings or obscured identification may heighten defensive reactions from the public during encounters, potentially making those interactions more dangerous for both officers and civilians. It creates tension.
And trust.
Research is also cited showing that a lack of trust in the police is a major barrier to reporting crimes, particularly for racially minoritized young women reporting harassment. This stems from perceptions of apathy, bias, or not taking concerns seriously, all of which, the sources argue, would be exacerbated if officers are unidentifiable and perceived as less accountable.
Systemic weaknesses in law enforcement accountability mechanisms already exist, even when officers are identified, right?
Yeah.
So anonymity just makes a bad situation worse.
That's a critical point the sources connect. They provide an example from Pennsylvania, noting that the state's police misconduct database has loopholes, like not requiring the upload of all disciplinary actions unless they result in a final or binding action, and not requiring agencies to explain why they hire officers with prior records. The sources argue that if systemic issues exist in ensuring accountability, even with identification, the problem becomes exponentially harder when that identification is obscured from the outset.
So masking or anonymity is like a first barrier.
Exactly. It creates a fundamental initial barrier to even initiating any process of accountability. You can't even start if you don't know who is involved.
So the push for anonymity, whether through masking, ruses, or legislation that chills reporting, combined with these pre-existing systemic weaknesses in accountability, creates a dangerous synergy. Is that the idea?
That's the source's ultimate conclusion in this segment. They argue this combination severely undermines public trust and the rule of law. Obscuring identity obstructs the vital first step of identification, while systemic failures ensure that even if misconduct is somehow reported, downstream consequences are not guaranteed,
Leading to a perception, and potentially a reality, of impunity for those who abuse authority. People feel like officers can get away with things.
Exactly. This cultivates perceived impunity, which, the sources argue, profoundly erodes public trust, particularly within marginalized communities that may already have strained relationships with law enforcement.
So the takeaway is?
The sources conclude that efforts to decrease officer identifiability, whether through policy or legislative means like the bill we discussed, risk exacerbating existing crises of police legitimacy and accountability, making it significantly harder for victims of misconduct or abuse to seek redress, and for the public to ensure that those wielding state power are acting lawfully and ethically.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive into the source material regarding Senator Marsha Blackburn's record, and specifically the critique presented in these documents concerning her public actions, statements, and proposed legislation.
We've explored the allegations raised in documents regarding ethical lapses, like that traffic stop incident, and examined how her public stances on social and cultural issues are perceived and critiqued, particularly highlighting the analysis of her claims regarding Planned Parenthood.
And we've spent significant time delving into her rhetoric on race and migration, including her opposition to CRT and DEI, her stances on immigration enforcement, and specific instances like the China cheating tweet and her involvement with birther legislation.
Right. The sources present these, alongside her rhetorical patterns, as grounds for critique, which critics, as presented in these documents, have labeled as indications of racism or xenophobia, contributing to a pattern of discourse the sources describe as problematic and potentially harmful.
And we've conducted a detailed analysis based on the sources of the potential implications of her proposed Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act on fundamental rights like free speech, transparency, and public accountability.
Contrasting her stated justifications for the bill with the significant concerns raised by civil liberties advocates and the constitutional questions posed by its language and scope.
Finally, we looked at the broader context of law enforcement anonymity, drawing on the sources' analysis of inconsistent federal policies and documenting real-world dangers they link to obscured identity.
Such as criminal impersonation and an increased risk of sexual violence against vulnerable populations, arguing that policies allowing officers to remain unidentifiable erode essential public trust and hinder accountability mechanisms.
The sources consistently highlight a fundamental tension, don't they, between the stated goals of protecting law enforcement and ensuring security and the foundational principles of government transparency, citizen oversight, and the constitutional protection of speech.
Particularly as these issues impact vulnerable populations, that tension is really central to the critique.
This deep dive has given us a detailed look at the specific critiques and allegations presented in this particular set of source material regarding Senator Blackburn's record and her approach to key policy issues.
It prompts us to consider how these specific claims and analyses from the sources contribute to understanding the broader debates around accountability, civil liberties, and political rhetoric in the current landscape.
Building on everything these sources have laid out, here's something for you, our listener, to consider as you go about your day. In a democratic society, how do we effectively balance the very real need to ensure the safety of law enforcement officers with the fundamental right of the public to identify, scrutinize, and hold accountable those who wield the power of the state?
It's a critical question, isn't it? And it lies right at the heart of the tensions presented in the sources we explored today.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Our eyes are heavy, but we won't blink. Not when the truth is being buried and the powerful demand silence. They want us exhausted. They want us to look away. But we know better. We know that staying vigilant is how the lies unravel, how the cruelty is exposed, how the systems built on oppression begin to crack. This movement is only possible because of collective strength, because of you. We see, we expose, we rise. Let's keep watch, together. Support Eyes on Ice at kofi.com/eyesonice, kofi.com/EYESONICE. Every contribution ensures we won't shut our eyes. Not now, not ever.